Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Under the Dome from Town Meeting TV. My name is Bobby Lucier. We're here on January 23rd, 2024, to hear Governor Phil Scott's budget address for the 2024 session, as well as hear the response from the legislative leadership. This is Under the Dome. Thank you for joining us.
We can work towards that vision of vibrant neighborhoods, full of families breathing life back into communities, healthy and safe kids filling classrooms and reaching their fullest potential. Great jobs with solid employers, entrepreneurs from all walks of life, and a thriving, growing economy that gives Vermonters the security and opportunity they deserve for all they do and all they invest. I know we can get there. And I've never been more energized to help Vermonters and communities turn catastrophe into opportunity once more.
The governor said during his speech that he expects that disagreements will arise not over what's in his budget, but what's not in his budget. Do you agree?
I would, because I said that last year. There are certainly areas, for example, the level funding of key services. And so if there's anything that we've been talking about, and that is mental health treatment, and so to level fund that delivery system, which is what is proposed in the governor's budget, I'm sure will be a topic of a lot of discussion. On the mental health front, though, I would say, and we were talking about it, the whole embedding mental health clinicians with police was something we take a great deal of pride in. It was done right here in the Senate. And so it's really very rewarding to take something that we put in the budget and see that it was embraced and in fact seems to be effective. And then I'll pass it off. But the other thing I would say that we did that the governor obviously didn't necessarily embrace last year, and we're just beginning to see it, and that is what we've done with our child care program. And I would submit that if we are really thinking about strategies to attract families, support working families, and most families, both parents have to work. What we've done and set the scene with our child care initiative is really one of the most important actions that we have taken relative to workforce availability, affordability, and supporting working families.
And I serve on housing and economic development in the morning and finance in the afternoon. And the governor did talk about housing and helping housing. The only two proposals I'm aware of are to freeze the property tax of those buildings for 5 years. Anything that gets built new or is rehabbed. And we already have quite a generous program for rehabbing. That concerns me because in the afternoon, ever since the December 1st letter came out with the possible up to 18% in property tax increase, the chair of Ways and Means and myself, that's what we've been working on. And we have not heard a word from the administration. It would, I was very pleased to see the governor said we all need to work together, because I think we do. The schools are in a tight place. They've got a perfect economic storm hitting them right now. But I think we're all agreed that 18%, and when you add to the flood devastated communities, a significant local property tax increase, that's going to be unbearable.
I would agree in terms of some things that weren't in the budget. He didn't offer any solutions on the December 1st letter and the 18% potential tax increase. And we were listening for that and didn't hear it. If you're governor, you have the ability to address only what you want. And he talked a lot about fixing problems rather than funding them when he didn't want to spend money. When he did want to spend money, then it was a great initiative that he was willing to describe. I'll just give you one more specific example, and that is the motel program. So the administration has put forward in the budget adjustment $8.2 million to fund the program through April 1st, and then $4 million for shelter capacity. But they admit, and Chris Winters was in our committee, he admitted that that leaves about 400 or 500 families out of the program. There's no money there between April and July 1st to carry those families in the motels or in shelter capacity that's equal to what they have now. That was the goal of Act 81. And in effect, what the administration is saying is that we would like the June 1st cohort to go away, and then we'll pick up in July with who remains. But those, again, are the most vulnerable. And seeing them on the street with kids or disabilities or at an advanced age is something we're not willing to do. So again, even though they told us that they would fix that problem last year, a year has gone by and we're in the exact same position where we will have to carry that investment.
Are you skeptical about the plan to establish 5 state?
No, I'm not skeptical of the 5 shelters, but even if you add the 6, they're now talking about a location in Waterbury that would add 50. Even if it's 300, we have, again, another 400 or 500 families that won't be covered by that. And that's families. So if you're talking individuals, you're talking 700 or 800 people who aren't covered by those shelters. So
400 or 500. So even if they built all of the shelters,
yes,
That's a
there,
count.
right,
Yes.
April 1st.
and you can go back to the testimony and appropriations from both Chris Winters and Secretary Samuelson.
Okay, thank you.
In regards to the budget address not touching on the December 1st letter, Kristen Harlan and Town address.
Yep.
Everything that it would cost $200 million, because she says to buy down that property tax increase. She said they didn't really have the money to do that. And so when we asked, well, what do you propose to get this spending under control? So you think they pointed to, I think, initiatives they proposed in 2017, 18, and 19. Do you have a response to that?
Well, even if we put all of those initiatives into the budget, it wouldn't affect this year's tax rate, right?
Yeah.
So they offered basically retread proposals that had been rejected earlier by the legislature for several reasons, and nothing that would impact this year. So he did say that people could talk to their school boards and their superintendents, and of course they can, but we all know how effective that is in isolation. So I was hoping for a strategy, and again, we will wind up developing a strategy because that vacuum now exists.
I think the schools, we knew this was going to be a difficult year. The schools have lost ESSER funds, and they have primarily used those to provide mental health and some scholastic services for kids during the COVID era. That's gone away. The need hasn't. And this gets back to our level funding of mental health. We've done that for so many years that the mental health services can't provide the services to the schools, so the schools hire their own. The need is still there, and the schools feel morally bound to keep providing services to those kids. So we've lost that. We had a rapid increase in housing values in the last few years, which has put more and more schools down under the CLA, which raises their rates anyway. And we're all trying to find a way to work through that. And we also have the waiting study going in. So we think there's been some misinterpretation of that implementation strategy. And Representative Kornheiser and I have sent a letter to the school superintendent saying, no, if your budget goes up 12%, your tax rate's capped at 5%. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So we have a public hearing this week, and we're trying to get to the bottom of it and see if there's some way we can tone down that 18%.
One thing that, is my understanding of what the point the governor was trying to make was that, I proposed cost containment ideas in the past, and it cost me dearly, right? It didn't lead to a productive conversation. It was used against me politically, and I would like, if this conversation were to start again, for the legislature to kind of, go first, right? And I'm wondering what you think of that. Do you think there's something fair in that or not?
I think as you characterize it, it's exactly the reverse. So Phil Scott, for instance, proposed raising class sizes, but he's never really suffered any serious attack for proposing larger class sizes. We have suffered the attacks because if you remember in his first year, in the very end game of the session, he popped out the number of $19 million that we owed him and then attacked us all the way through to the election on education funding. That was his first biennium. So I think generally speaking, we have come forward with workable proposals. They have sometimes involved increases in taxes, and we've been attacked every year on that. What I will say is that I appreciated from the governor, there was a bipartisan thread through the speech. So he talked about areas where we were in agreement. I was glad to see the $5 million in bridge funding for the state university. That's something he didn't include last year, and he did this year. The other thing I would say is he used the phrase, "I was wrong," when it came to certain criminal reform things that he signed. Some of those I worked on in judiciary, and I still believe in them. But the governor tends to believe with some people that things like raise the age are responsible for increased crime rates. I don't necessarily believe that myself. That's raise the age is just where you start, family court or criminal court. So I don't believe it's contributed to a spike in crime. But again, I was glad to hear him shoulder some of the burden. We don't see that a lot from the administration. So in that way, it was kind of a mature speech. But then there was some of the old, I will let you come out with strategies on the tough things. So for instance, the 18% tax increase, he's just not going there except to say that people should vote their school budgets down. If they don't, it's on us.
Senator Control, you pointed to as a means of attracting more families to the state for childcare. Were you implying that you think that we should increase our childcare spending this year, or
No, I didn't mean to say increase. I'm referring to the major piece of legislation that we passed, really just starting to be implemented in January, and what it would, how it would benefit families. If there's anything, if I were listening in the general public, it was like, what is there to be optimistic about? And what is kind of that vision, and where do we want to go? Sure, we have a lot of work to do, but we have many, many strengths, and how can we build on them? And so that's an example, I think, of where we did make an investment, and no reference was made, even though it wasn't something the governor necessarily embraced. So that's what I was saying. That was an example of something the legislature did that, from my perspective, had multiple benefits to Vermonters. And so I think we have things to celebrate. And I didn't see a lot of celebration. And if I'm listening as a general Vermonter, was like, it was, things that I've wanted haven't gone, and we have a supermajority, and therefore it's like hitting my head against a brick wall. And I don't think that, for me, that's how I want to approach things. I try to work very collaboratively. I continue to be disturbed that the governor says the budget that we passed last year had a 13% increase. It did, because it included a lot of one-time spending, but the base was not 13%. So that creates the impression, if I don't know what that constitutes, that I'm a profligate spender. And I'm a Vermonter from way back, and I view myself as very much a guardian of the budget and the decisions and the integrity of the budget and the sustainability. So those are the kinds of comments that I think, if I'm in the general public, could be really create a source of concern.
What did you think of the fact that, criminal justice reform took up so much real estate in his budget?
Well, he's hitting public safety, and so are we. That's been one of our priorities since we gavelled in, and will continue to be. We disagree over some things. I think There are some things that are more atmospheric that won't actually impact crime. So for instance, all the emphasis on raise the age. But I do think that we're looking in judiciary right now on increased penalties for fentanyl and xylazine. Those are discussions that will be ongoing all the way through the session. He didn't mention overdose prevention sites. It's not something he supports. But he did, you'll notice, talk about the phrase harm reduction and said we should consider harm reduction reducing harm to the community as well. I don't think anyone of any stripe has ever used the phrase harm reduction and not meant the community as well as the individual. We're always talking about preventing deaths, but also making things safer because of the problems that follow addiction. Where we differ, I think, is he referred to it sort of euphemistically as some say we should take bold action. I think that was an indirect reference to overdose prevention sites. I believe that they would be helpful in a couple of communities that have opted to say they want them. And that's an ongoing disagreement that will see probably result in a veto and possibly result in an override.
What about the bail reform? You seem to be suggesting that so much of the crime in the state is connected.
We are looking,
Release.
yeah, we are looking at violations of conditions of release, VCR, and I agree there. I mean, when people are given conditions of release, if they're then charged with a VCR and go free and then charged with another VCR, you can't say you have a functioning detainment system. So we're looking at that and I expect action on that. With that said, I wouldn't paint with a broad brush all of the criminal reform we've done over the last 5 or 10 years and say those were all mistaken ventures and we need to repeal and go back to where we were in 2015.
What do you make of the governor's proposals thus far on flood recovery? Do you find them adequate? Do you have an issue with them?
Since I've got two of the largest flooded cities, from what I heard the governor say is that they will come up with some money to help with the FEMA copay. That is good and that will be helpful, but it is nowhere near the help that the cities say that they need. They have lost large portions of their grand list. They've lost revenue. They've lost, businesses and homes. They have a long way to go. And if we don't help them, then the local property taxpayers are going to be hit with that bill.
And if I could just point out, we just passed out our first bill, which was to alleviate some of this problem municipalities will experience with the taxes for properties that are now off the grand list. So, one down and a number of initiatives to go.
I have one more question. So you mentioned how you are not thrilled that the governor not maybe has a tangible plan such as the property tax, but it's also mentioned you have this majority. You guys don't necessarily do what he wants to do, and sometimes he doesn't really feel like he has a position of power. So him maybe suggesting his plans, you guys won't even really take them up seriously anyway. What would you make of that argument?
I would say it's a vast overstatement. We do work in appropriations and finance especially. We work very, very much with the governor's team. Let me just give you an example of the way it looks from our side. So on Act 250 reform, we are working on that in the House and the Senate. And as the governor noted, there are a number of bills, a couple he supports and a couple he might not immediately support. But all that work is going forward in good faith, I think. But if you go back and look at what he said, the people who oppose 719, H719, he referred to as special interests and said that he and the people who drafted 719 are the people, whereas anybody who opposes that bill or its companion in the Senate are the special interests. Now, among the people who support 719 are the Chamber of Commerce and builders and others who have a real economic stake in the outcome. That makes them in one sense a special interest, but they have a real interest and they should have their voice heard. But a lot of times when the governor's invoking the phrase special interest, he's applying a very direct form of pressure to not oppose that bill. So I wasn't happy necessarily to see that enter into what he was trying to call a tripartisan process.
I think I've been here since before we had a supermajority, and I've been here through 4 governors, I guess, and I found this administration to be much less involved in the legislative process. At one point, I got called out and asked to do something for the governor, and I said, well, come in and, we'll have you talk to the committee. Well, I mean, are you going to support it? Because we're not going to bring it out to get it voted down. Other governors have been, I would hear, we don't like this, and I'd hear it in February or March and have time to work on it, whereas this governor seems to wait until May to let us know that we're not going to go home until he gets what he wants, and that's not constructive. We all need to work together because we've got some serious problems, and they aren't partisan. Education funding, the transportation fund, mental health funding, those, we all need those.
The only other thing I would comment is the legislature does have a slight disadvantage. We have no policy staff. So a lot of what you would need to do to offer proposals really require staff that can look at evidence, what other states might be doing. And so we have to rely, I think that it's what Senator Cummings is saying, on the administration that is much more richly staffed. We have nothing, so anything is more than that. And so I do think to say, here legislature, it's a terrible problem. We look to you to figure it out. The resources and the expertise that we have available to draw on is very, very limited compared to the policy experts that exist throughout all the departments and agencies and state government. I just bring that up as an example of the challenges for the legislature to be to really kind of solo try to work on some of these very complicated issues.
The governor has really drawn a line in the sand and categorically will not support any increased tax rates across the board. Is that a boundary that you would also support, or do you think that that option needs to be left on the table?
I think it's premature
Yeah.
to make a statement like that. For example, when we do the tax rate, that's going to be an increase.
And-
And
we don't control that. I mean, the voters that vote the budgets determine how much, is to be spent. We subtract all the state-based funding, mostly the sales tax revenue, and then we set a tax rate or a yield that will raise the necessary funding. But we don't decide what's to be spent. That's local control. It's the local people. And that's frustrating for us because we get blamed for raising the taxes. But it's really the people that vote the budgets that do.
There was one thing missing in this budget pass that you should review. If you pinpoint something that you really wish the governor would have touched on.
Well, I do think we've called it the elephant in the room, but the potential 18% tax increase, the trouble in the ed fund, I get that as governor, you don't have to address that. And so you're given an hour. Why dirty your hands with that? But the truth is, that's the number one concern for all of us in the building right now. I know it's one of the governor's number one concerns. So again, in terms of courage, and he always uses phrases like take things head on, do the hard work. If you're going to do the hard work, if you're going to take it head on, you would talk about that tax increase and say, I can do this from my end. What can you do? Or this is how I envision us. He said we can't buy it down. I get that. But what do you suggest otherwise, other than, as he said, talking to your superintendent? Might make you feel good, but that's not a solution.
And some of the solutions should be coming from the Department of Education. And that's under the governor's control. And we haven't had a secretary since last June.
Yes.
And so that department has sent out, I know it sent one school the wrong numbers. We need a vigorous department there to help the schools figure out ways that they can just produce better classroom outcomes, to do the things that need to be done, and we haven't gotten that.
What do you think a response from the legislature could look like in terms of
I would say it's a little early to be talking about that. I would just say we're considering everything because, you know, in a certain way, the governor is there to protect Vermonters. We are also there to protect Vermonters, including their wallets. And I can tell you, we've already had, I would say, 5 or 6 meetings just on that issue. Before we get into whether they're worthy policy things, they wouldn't impact the 18%. So we're focused on that piece of it, but it's a good point. Let's take class sizes. So we've had testimony over the last 5 years, pre-pandemic, but more post-pandemic, about real behavioral issues in classrooms. You know, that there are incidents of violence in classrooms. There are children of people who are affected by the opioid epidemic, all sorts of tie-ins to the other public safety problems we've been experiencing. If our solution is to say to teachers, you're going to have 10 more students, that might help the bottom line a year or 2 down the road, and it might not, but it would certainly degrade the quality of what's going on in the classroom.
And a lot of our schools, you know, the reason there's only 5 kids in the class is because there's only 5 kids in that grade. We have very small schools, and you can't create children that aren't there.
You mentioned like you pick up any of the governor's ideas that won't fix next year's problems, right? Because they wouldn't be in place. But do you think the legislature should be looking at long-term cost containment?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say we always are. In the education world, as the governor likes to point out, we have a declining student population. And I think that's a fair point. What does our infrastructure around those students look like? So asking communities to form larger districts in Act 46, that was, you know, and I were both working on that. That was one of the solutions to try to find economies of scale. That was a 5-year effort to try to do that. And those sorts of efforts continue all the time. It's just that the governor likes the dramatic quick solution, which is either cuts to district. So in his tenure, he's proposed, you know, several times multi-million-dollar cuts immediately to school budgets, and also increases in student size of anywhere from 7 to 10 students per class. Either of those things would reduce the bottom line very quickly, but we believed, after we investigated them, that they would also hurt student outcomes. So we didn't put them into practice.
The only other thing I can say is we've tried to examine, for example, the use of paraeducators, looking at where staff has been added, where those expenditures look like. And some of the things that may have evolved, in fact, aren't consistent with best educational practices. And so I think we're going to have to engage more to understand where the expenditures are being derived, where we know we are increasing the number of teachers in the classroom. So where are those costs being experienced? What do those trends look like? What has been that workforce growth? Those are the kinds of things that I think could help us make the informed decisions around policies and how to respond more strategically.
And that's where we depend on the administration, because we don't have the staff that can do that kind of, you know, just analysis really, and just counting heads and telling us what the problem is.
And just one last illustration of this. If you go and look at the org chart for the Agency of Education over the last 10 years, you'll see that it has shrunk. And that is, I would think, hard to do accidentally. In fact, as Ann noted, it was months and months and months before we had an acting secretary in there, let alone a permanent secretary. So I think the administration's approach to education tends to be, let's spend less now and look for better outcomes. You remember he talked in his speech twice about fixing programs rather than funding them. And that's great if that's actually what's happening. But I would argue that in some cases, if you're not willing to fund, you're not going to get a fix. So in the case of the Agency of Education, the special education has had problems with the federal government because they're improperly staffed. As Ann noted, we've had all sorts of glitches in data that have been provided to school districts. So over the last couple of years, 2 or 3 major tranches of data went out to school districts that were incorrect, from the weights to other payments that they could expect.
Yes.
So,
This year, in the budget adjustment, we're having to
Yeah.
make up.
there is a philosophy at work about education, and when you look at AOE, it's not a functional philosophy.
With the motel program set to expire in April, what do you see as the path forward, either in the governor's budget or in your programs for the folks that are using that program?
We've talked about it, the budget adjustment. We know that it will add more slots because they're adding more emergency housing, but the slots are not equal to the number of households currently in motels. So we had that question earlier, what happens to that gap of households if you're bringing, I can't remember, it was under 300 additional beds,
Yeah.
and you've got 680 households in that June 30th cohort, what happens to them April 1st? We suspect the governor, like before, is not going to say, and many of them have disabilities, or they're seniors, or they have families. So what we're seeing is, at least in the budget adjustment, and we have to figure out what's in the budget, doesn't seem to be adequate to address the realities of what that population looks like April 1st. And that's going to be something we'll obviously have to spend time on.
I'll just add that I think Vermonters want us to be honest with them, with the situation, whether it has to do with the issue you just spoke to, or what we're dealing with in the housing crisis, what we're dealing with in the public safety, the public health crisis, the climate crisis. Vermonters want us to step up and show up to do that work for them. And I think Vermonters don't want to hear from us about, I don't know, nitpicking scoring points or feeling bitter about things. We have work to do. And I think we have shown in the past how we get it done, and we do hard things. And most of the time we do them well.
The governor said he doesn't think there's going to be a lot of disagreement about what's in the budget. He said he thinks the disagreement is going to be over what's not in the budget. Anything that you didn't hear today that you were hoping would be a part of his budget?
Well, we're still diving in the details of what is in the budget and what is not in the budget. I will say that, climate resiliency and flood recovery are really big priorities for us. And I want to get a better understanding of what he's proposing in those realms. We know that Vermonters are hurting. They are still hurting from the flood, and we need to do everything we can to support them through this. So we'll be diving into those details as we get a better sense of the numbers and the spreadsheets. And we'll be talking with the governor with whatever concerns we have.
I would add sometimes something can be mentioned in the speech, and then, if only $500,000 is put towards it, that might not turn any curve or make any policy difference. And so these are not times to be nibbling around the edges. If we want to continue our momentum on housing, we need to really invest in that in a meaningful way. We have projects in the pipeline. We don't want to lose steam on that. If we want Vermonters to live here and thrive and new Vermonters to come here, we need to make sure that we're continuing to work on our incredibly fantastic investments we made last year in childcare, so that kids are cared for and so that families can make it work.
And when you talk about not nibbling around the edges in terms of funding some of these initiatives, I mean, what is there a willingness, or do you see a path forward for raising revenues or raising taxes to fund some of these?
So statutorily, the administration is actually required to put forward a revenue package along with the budget every year. That's a piece that's certainly been left behind the last many years. And so that's something that we're going to need to, again, be the ones who do the work on ourselves.
It was only about a week ago that the administration came to the legislature and said, we need your help, and we would love to help. And it was in a collaborative manner that the House Human Service Committee heard from Commissioner Winters about their idea on the GA and how to make changes, the beginnings of the changes in the budget adjustment that to be able to realize what needs to happen. And the Human Services Committee will be working in this next FY25 on another level of reforms and that. So we look forward to bringing that piece of it to the floor this week.
I know you said you're still digging into the details, of course, but what was your initial reaction to that 3.8% kind of top line figure that the governor is proposing for an increase?
It's the devil's in the details. And that's what we get to. We get to look in underneath it. And what does it mean? What does that result in for services for Vermonters? What are they going to do without because of that?
According to Finance Commissioner Adam Gresham, this budget assumes a vacancy rate of 8 to 9% across state government in FY25. Is that cause for concern for any of you?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Being a state employee, and I can't remember if I said this before, is something that it should be an employment place that is sought after and preferred. And so the state employees that are out there doing that work every day deserve the support and not to get have negative backlash all the time about their not being able to do everything when they don't have all the resources they need to get it done.
Right, asking currency employees to cover many other jobs that aren't theirs isn't going to be productive, and it's not going to be good for Vermonters.
I want state employees to have the resources that they need to answer the phone when a Vermonter calls and has a question or needs help.
Share a little bit about what you heard in the budget address from the governor just now.
Yeah, absolutely. As we expected from the state, the governor is certainly highlighting that now is not a time for big investments or bold changes. And, I have to say I disagree. I think that what we're looking at today and a lot of the crises we're looking at are the result of a lack of investment and a lack of bold action to really change the status quo. So I think now is exactly the time that we need to take the crises we're facing and, as he likes to say, turn them into opportunities. But that is through transformative change. That is through bold action, and it is an investment in everyday people. I also think it's really concerning to me that he didn't mention the climate catastrophe once in his entire address. Certainly spoke some of the flooding and spoke some of the storms we've been seeing, but didn't really address what we know to be the underlying cause of that, which is climate change. And, as a social worker, I also found it really problematic that his focus on substance use disorder was really around crime and not around the catastrophic impact to the people who are in despair and struggling with substance use and don't have the resources to stay alive.
Yeah, so that when he talked about rolling back some of the Raise the Age work that you all did a few years ago, what do you think the impact of that would be?
Well, so first of all, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the governor has stood in the way of actually implementing the Raise the Age policy that was passed a few years ago. So he's alluding to impacts that we've never actually seen because we really haven't raised the age, because his administration has come back year after year and said we can't do it. The other thing he talked a lot about was rolling back the bail reforms that we implemented a few years ago, and I think that that's also sort of a red herring. Constitutionally, bail in the state of Vermont is only allowed to be used to ensure someone returns to court. It's not allowed to be used for public safety. You can hold someone without bail if they are deemed to be a public safety response, but bail can't be used in that way under our Vermont Constitution. And what we know from the Crime Research Group is that those who are released on bail and those who are released on their own recognizance return at the same rate. So bail isn't even working to do the one and only thing it's allowed to do, but we do have over 200 Vermonters sitting in our jails pre-trial before they've been convicted of a crime simply because they can't pay bail. So I think that rather than roll back the very minimal bail reforms we implemented a few years back, we actually need to go further, and we need to eliminate cash bail as a tool for holding people, because it's not doing what it's supposed to do, but it is not serving justice, in that it is holding people simply for a debt in our jail system. And we know that even just 36 hours incarcerated increases the likelihood of recidivism and higher level, more violent crime in the future.
When the governor talks about what he hears from families around the tax burden and property taxes being a huge challenge to families in Vermont, is that something that you hear as well, or how do you respond to that when you're thinking about making bold, big investments at the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think That's very real. I think that the property tax burden on our lower and moderate income Vermonters is incredibly difficult, and an 18% rise in property tax rates for those individuals is unfathomable. But we have another group of people, the top 1/3 of earners in Vermont, who pay a fraction of a percentage of their income in comparison to what the everyday Vermonters pay. And those people can afford to pay more. And so I think it's really looking at, one innovative change that we've looked at and talked about for decades in the State House is actually moving the education fund off of the property tax and instead creating a progressive income-based tax where we ask that richest 1/3 of Vermonters to pay their fair share into the system. And not only would that allow us to ease the burden on middle and lower income Vermonters, it would bring more money into the education fund. So I think it's really important that we look at the whole base of taxpayers and who is paying huge percentages of their income and who is only paying a fraction of a percent of their income.
I just want to share a little bit about what you heard from the governor today.
Great. So the governor's budget address felt very similar to his State of the State address a couple weeks ago here in the legislature. He really framed out his way of seeing the world, and there was unfortunately a tone of not willing to really collaborate with this second branch of government, which is the legislature, in a way that brings true collaboration forward. It felt a lot of, this is the way I see it, why haven't you taken my ideas, this is how I see the world, and really putting a borderline scapegoating kind of framing of how he sees all the challenges of Vermont, but then kept accusing the supermajority, which is the majority of Democrats and progressives here in this building, as the problem, rather than seeing us as collaborators and colleagues and really working together to find policy that brings us to compromise to solve these challenges. So that was concerning to hear that again repeated in the budget address. I think that we have a lot of challenges this particular fiscal year now that one-time federal funds are slowly starting to dry up now that money's been allocated. This could have been an opportunity to really come, sharpen his pencil, and show some ways that we could collaborate based on what we've learned throughout the pandemic. And if anything, I see sort of a reversion. He mentioned it several times in his speech about his ideas from 4, 5, 6 years ago that he thinks are grand and great, and failing to kind of really take into account that we were also elected and represent a diversity of communities and hear daily from our constituents, whether they're folks in Burlington struggling with priorities of shouldering more than 1/3 of the Vermont's homeless population in our streets, or the opioid crisis that's showing up in everyone's communities, or flood-ravaged communities. I think he fails to really appreciate the perspective and the value and the wisdom we also bring to the table.
The governor talked about talking about the addiction opioid crisis and also public safety, talked about holding repeat offenders accountable and rolling back even some of the efforts that were made around raising the age. What do you think the impact of that would be if the governor's plan were to go into effect in that way?
I found his reflection on public safety and the framing out of a changing statutory criminal justice law concerning, because to me it fails to tell the full story of what's happening in our criminal justice system and how we really should think about accountability. So a critical part that folks need to know is that our criminal justice system is overtaxed. There's not enough capacity to deal with the backlog still from COVID, and so states' attorneys have long caseloads. So if we were to strengthen criminal justice code and put more people into that system, the system is broken. It is overwhelmed, and it's a dead end kind of approach to really addressing what's showing up in our communities. And also, the governor has not appointed enough judges. So right now, even if states' attorneys were working extra overtime, they can't even get enough court time to clear the dockets of what's currently still waiting to be heard and considered. So that piece is concerning. The other part really concerning is he talked a lot about stricter enforcement, especially on young folks, children, and not having folks go into Department of Children and Families, and instead wants to put them into the corrections system. And to me, when we look at innovative and progressive and important policy changes we've done over the last few years, looking at bail reform, looking at expungement, looking at raising the age, those are very purposeful criminal justice or really human rights related targeted justice reform that benefits young people and sets people up for success in their life, rather than creating these huge barriers for their economic trajectory in life and their well-being in life, because they've made some poor decisions very young in life before their brains are even fully developed, and then get thrown into our criminal justice system and come out further harmed afterward. We all know that when people come out with criminal records, it's much harder to find jobs. It's much harder to find housing. There's impacts on mental health. There's impacts on, especially if someone goes in regardless of their age with substance use disorder, there's not treatment there. There's worse healthcare outcomes for folks in those systems. So it felt very cavalier for him to sort of to say that's the only way we can think about accountability is to strengthen the criminal justice code. There's a lot more we can be doing, especially with young folks. And if he's committed to prevention work, then we really need to be going way more upstream and strengthening our schools, because that was another piece he talked about, is his ongoing quest around education spending. Well, if we actually think about schools as spaces for prevention work, we also think about our schools as, when we strengthen them and make sure they're adequately resourced, not only for existing Vermonters, but for the Vermonters we want to attract to move here, that's a recruitment strategy as well. When people relocate, they look at how strong are the public schools. And if we start to roll back the pensions for teachers, we roll back the investments in giving them decent, dignified health care, then that's going to weaken our schools and it's going to further weaken our state, and we will not be a place where folks will want to relocate.
When the governor mentions these larger investments that he's sort of cautioning against, as the state, in his view, the state is unable to afford some of the larger investments that the Democrats and the progressives are pushing towards. What can you describe a couple of those big investments that he's referring to?
Well, I think one of the big ones is around folks who are unhoused in our state. And so it was interesting. He did a very fast drive-by of the motel program, which is the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program that we use as motels. It was interesting when he admitted at one point about sort of being reflective around his maybe making a different decision related to bail reform, et cetera. He did not admit his mistake around the motel emergency program from a year ago, where he was going to just completely abruptly end the program. There was no solution. He and his administration had 2 years to come up with a humane off-ramp to that program, and it was abruptly going to end until several of us legislators really pushed back and said that is not only going to cause great harm in communities who will shoulder these folks relocating there because they have nowhere else to go, and Burlington was one of those communities, but it was also not a humane way to treat Vermonters in terms of just this abrupt end of the program. So he did mention more funding in that program, but I would have liked to hear some reflection on why, but also he talked about sustainability, and I would have liked in this last year, since that last debate last summer, to really understand what are the sustainable ways to support folks who need emergency housing, temporary emergency housing, beyond this motel program, or beyond the temporary shelters we're building, which are so costly. So if he really wants to be a steward of of public funds in smart and strategic ways, which he talks about again in the speech, to me, what has the administration been doing for the last 10 months with this very critical need and very critical moment of investment? To me, we also need to kind of couple that with our opioid crisis and understanding where we really need to double down with resources and investments where we can literally save Vermonters' lives, and not look at it as a cost in the line item in the budget that we have to be stingy about, but really know that there is an incredibly important need to invest in supporting Vermonters who are struggling with addiction.
Can you just tell us a little bit of what you heard from the governor today?
Well, I heard from the governor 3 main things that we need to concentrate on, and those are public safety, housing, and affordability. And those are the 3 key issues that people are asking me about every day.
How are you thinking about the budget constraints this year in comparison to the need for investment in a lot of big issues that we're focusing on that you just mentioned?
Well, for those of us who've been around this building for a while, we know that there are times in which we have to tighten belts because we don't have the money. We can't print it like the federal government can, and we have to be responsible, and we have to be careful about what we spend. We have to do it wisely and on the things that will make the greatest difference for Vermonters. Affordability, housing, and public safety are those issues right now.
As you're the leader of the minority Republican Party, right? How do you think about working across the aisle, and what do you anticipate as you hope to collaborate with your colleagues and the other parties here?
Sure. We're already collaborating. On housing, for example, we have a press conference just a couple weeks ago in which members of all three parties got together to talk about what we need to do in common. We've got to work together to make this work.
Well, that'll do it for Under the Dome from Town Meeting TV. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned for the rest of the session as Under the Dome continues to cover the legislature this year. You can find this episode and many more on Town Meeting TV's YouTube channel. So long.